you very much, Ellis. And my neighbors pull this out because sometimes I like to move around. So sorry, sound people. But thank you all for coming out, because on a weeknight, it's not typical that you say, oh, I think I'll go unless some politician going on about stuff. But there are really some important issues facing our province right now, and I really mean that. Just tell you very quickly a little bit about myself. I was first elected in 2001. I was the youngest cabinet minister at the time in the government of Gordon Campbell, and I served for up till 2012. I retired as a deputy premier and minister of finance, and I retired because my eldest daughter at that time, Josephine, was not quite 2, and my wife was pregnant with her second daughter. Although that wasn't public yet, I knew, and that was good enough for me to realize, I think I've done my time in public life here, and I'm going to go and be a dad along with my wife Jessica and raise our girls and go back into the private sector. Best decision I ever made. But I do want you to know why I came back, because I did, 10 years later. And it's because I'm concerned about, it's actually for the same reason I left, ironically. It's about my kids, not them specifically, but that generation. I really, really am concerned about the direction our province is going in, because I really want to make sure our kids and your grandkids can grow up in the kind of British Columbia we grew up in, where the future seemed limitless, and where we believed that if we worked hard and played by the rules, that we could get ahead and succeed just as everyone else could. And so I'm thrilled to be here tonight to talk about some of the challenges I see and some of the big opportunities I see. But you should know that I'm really honored to be with 2 of my colleagues here. Because Jackie Taggart, Fraser-Nicola is a huge riding. Even with the boundary changes, Jackie, it's unbelievably huge. And I'll tell you, Ellis can say exactly the same thing in Skeena. Their ridings are massive, okay? They cover huge territories. And they have to try and represent everyone as best they can, and it's tough. You did a great job with the community of Lytton. You may remember when Lytton burnt right to the ground, razed to the ground, literally. And 2.5 years later, do you think there's been any construction or activity going on there? No, it's unbelievable. The government can't even build houses in a community that was raised 2.5 years ago, and a lot of those people are still having to stay at friends' homes and couch surfing, and it's just it's really unacceptable. But I think it's also emblematic of some of the challenges that I'm going to talk about tonight. But I'll also tell you that my friend Ellis Ross is much too modest, because as chief of the Haisla, they call it chief counselor, I think, in the Haisla, but I still think of it as you're the chief, you're the number one person. He was a huge leader in First Nations communities. You need to understand this, because as Ellis used to always remind us, a very, very poor reserve, really difficult economic circumstances, and all the social ills that go along with that, the drug abuse, the alcohol abuse, etc. And Ellis realized how important it was to have economic opportunity, and he became one of the biggest leaders for saying LNG, liquefied natural gas, the natural gas that we have in abundance in this province, could be a ticket out of poverty for his community, and a great opportunity not just for the Indigenous folks up in the Northwest, but for the entire province, thinking beyond the Haisla. And because of his leadership and the leadership of the BC Liberals, and actually even before Christy Clark, of recognizing the huge opportunity that LNG presented to us as British Columbians in our province, it went ahead with your leadership. And I think we should acknowledge that, because this is exactly the kind of relationships we're trying to foster with First Nations, where we align our interests. And I always say to the chiefs that I meet with, Chief, I just have I'm a pretty straightforward guy. I'm not into the virtue signaling and all the other stuff that people like to do when they talk to First Nations. I am about results. I want to make sure that members of your First Nation say, I can't believe how well you're doing and getting things done working with government. And we've got all this economic opportunity in our nation, and this is fantastic. That's, to me, real success. All the other stuff, a lot of talk and a lot of, virtue signaling and all this kind of stuff, I really care about results. So I think you blazed a trail along with other Indigenous leaders, and that's the direction that we need to go in. So tonight, a few things. I'm going to touch on a few areas, and then I want to open it up to questions, because Q&As are really fun, and I think you folks should have an opportunity to tell us some of what you're hearing or what you're concerned about, so that we can make sure that if we don't reflect it already, we incorporate that into our thinking as we go back into the legislature to hold government to account. That's our official job, as the opposition caucus. Now we're now called BC United, as you know. It's no longer called BC Liberal. And United is a very important word to me, because I do think it's important that we try to unite British Columbians, especially free enterprise British Columbians, that believe that, if we have an economy with competitive tax rates and a government that understands that sometimes staying out of the way is the best thing we can do for the province and the economy, good things will happen. And when good things happen and people feel confident about the future and they make investments and they invest in their businesses and raise families here, then that's good for government, because it'll generate lots of revenues into government. So why am I concerned about what's happening today? Well, I'll tell you. Ellis mentioned LNG Canada. The three biggest projects actually taking place in British Columbia today are Site C Dam, that's one of them. The second one is the twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is the only pipeline that gets fuel from Alberta right down to the Lower Mainland. And the third, of course, LNG Canada. Together, those three projects represent about $80 billion of capital. That's a lot of money being invested into British Columbia. But they're also defined by two really unique things, all three of those projects. The first is that all three of those projects were supported, started, initiated, and moved along by the BC United, then known as BC Liberals. Okay, that's really important for you to know, because the second part of that equation is all three of them were very strongly opposed by our friends currently in government, the NDP government. And that's important for you to know, because I just want you to reflect for a moment and think, where would we be and what would happen if those three projects weren't underway in British Columbia right now, and that $80 billion of investment never took place? And the over 50,000, how many jobs in all three? It'd be more than 50, wouldn't it? Because that's just LNG. But all of those jobs are all six-figure jobs, and I mean all of them. They're family-supporting great jobs, and they'd all be gone. And so that's why I say this, because I want you to understand that leadership means you have to have the courage to make decisions, not just for the next election, but for the next generation. And I can tell you, when I was up there in 2010 with Gordon Campbell in Fort St. John announcing that we were going ahead with Site C, that was big. I knew I was probably not going to be there when it was completed, but I certainly knew how important that would be to my future kids and grandchildren one day. Just like W.A.C. Bennett had the vision to build the original dams that have benefited all of us for so many years. And just think today, because today, as we all know, we're looking at a shortage of electricity. But the current government was the opposition at the time. And their position was, we're totally against it, can't believe the BC Liberals are doing this, we don't need the power, that's surplus power, this is terrible, blah, 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 right? And we were doing more than just Site C, though. We were also doing independent power projects, where we went out to the private sector and said, you know what? We see a future where we want to make sure BC is energy independent, where we will never have to rely on other jurisdictions to get our energy. We want to make sure we're self-sufficient so that we can export and make money for British Columbians. So we called in the private sector to say, here's some opportunity to do what we call independent power projects. Many of them were what they call micro dams or run-of-the-river, solar, wind power, etc. Big investments came into British Columbia, over 90% of them with Indigenous partners. And I'll tell you, the Indigenous communities were very excited about this, because a lot of it took place on some of the traditional lands, and they got excited because it's clean energy, and this generated just wonderful returns. NDP got elected in 2017 and said, we're canceling all those, because that's just a giveaway to their corporate friends, right? I'm telling you exactly the language they use. That's a giveaway to their corporate friends. We don't need it. It's surplus power. Dumb BC Liberals. Why would they do this? Well, guess what? Just about, 9 months ago, I think it was, that Premier David Eby went up to a microphone and said, okay, so Site C is moving along. Yes, the budget's more than doubled under them, but it'll be built soon. However, it won't be enough power to meet today's needs, and therefore we are going to be calling for, and he didn't want to call them independent power projects. He tried to make up some other name. But then I guess somebody didn't give the message to the hydro person, who was the next person to come up and speak, and he goes, yeah, so those are called independent power projects, and we're putting out a call for 3,000 megawatts. And we were all laughing, right? Because what they're really saying is, we were totally wrong, and now we're gonna have to go do exactly what the BC Liberals were doing, but 7 years too late. And so I say that because I think it's thematic. So what else do we have to be concerned about? A lot. In British Columbia. We all know about healthcare. I'll open that up for questions anywhere, but at a high level,
I was a health minister for 2 years, by the way, 2009, 2010, and I promise you it was not a perfect healthcare system when Kevin Falcon was the health minister. But I'll also tell you, it wasn't like anything I'm seeing today. And I'm very, very concerned about our healthcare system. I actually think it's at risk of total implosion, to be honest, and I'm not overstating this. This is based on what I hear from doctors and nurses that are working on the front lines. So it's very concerning. 1 in 5 British Columbians cannot access a family physician. That's a real problem because they are the gatekeepers of the system that help direct you to the specialists that you're going to need, etc. We've got a cancer system that when I was Minister of Health, the one thing I could really brag about is we had the best cancer system in the country. Nobody argued that. The Canadian Institute for Health Information that collects all the data said BC, absolutely #1. We had the lowest mortality rates for cancer in North America. So we were really seen as just absolutely world class. Today we're at the absolute bottom in Canada, and we're now sending patients down to Bellingham to get basic radiation treatment. And interestingly there, the only other time that's ever happened in British Columbia history was actually back in the 1990s, the last time this government was in power, when they were again sending patients down to the United States. So what that tells you is that there is a self-made element to the crisis that we're facing here too. And I can talk more about that too. I do have to tell you, thank God you're all sitting down. One of the problems is there's too much administration, okay? They all laugh because everyone knows what I'm talking about, but I really mean it. Like, think about this for a second. We have 70 vice presidents in the healthcare system, okay? 70 earning over $250,000 each. Now, I can tell you the largest corporations in the world don't have 70 vice presidents. Why is it that just here in little BC with a $4.5 million population do we require 70 vice presidents? And I'll say this, if the 70 vice presidents were needed, then I'd expect to see, like if I started seeing really good results and everyone had a family doctor and things are getting, wait times are going down and stuff, I'd be like, well, you know, I would have never thought it possible, but I have to give them credit. These 70 vice presidents must be doing amazing work because everything's working out well. Problem is, we're not getting that, right? We're getting the exact opposite. So we can talk about that a little bit more later too. Crime I want to talk about too because I'm really concerned about crime. I can tell you that the current Premier, David Eby, was the Minister of Attorney General for 5.5 years. And his background with Pivot Legal Society, it's a radical group of anti-police, anti-pretty much everything folks. He wrote the book, How to Sue the Police. And I don't think that's a helpful book, frankly, because the police do a hell of a good job. And I really respect the work that they do, and I think they need to know that we've got their back in doing a tough job. But the problem is that a culture developed in the Ministry of Attorney General under his 5.5 years of what we call catch and release. Catch and release means people are charged with a crime, the police say that person did a very bad thing, we charge them, we recommend a charge to the Crown says, that's okay. We're gonna dismiss this, no charge necessary. They call it no charge assessments. No charge assessments increased by 75% over the last 7 years. That's not good. Because what happens is there gets to be a culture, I call it impunity, where criminals realize, because they talk to each other, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, there's not too many consequences here, so let's just go shoplift from the local store, and if I get arrested, I'll be out the same afternoon, and I probably won't get charged because they plea them down, let them go. That's not good. So we want to make sure that we change that. And I can talk to you about how we can do that if you want a question answered. So I'm just trying to give you sort of high level, and if you want more detail, I'll certainly answer that, but I just want to give you some high level. Other areas that we called for a ban on cell phone in schools. And I should tell you why we think that. My wife is a teacher, full confession. But I will tell you, how many of you have kids with cell phones or teenagers? Anyone? Okay. Some of you? How about grandkids with cell phones? Okay. Have you kind of noticed that they spend a lot of time like that? Well, it's really challenging in the schools for teachers. It really is, because the kids are spending a lot of time on Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok, and they're sending each other notes and stuff, as we would have done if we had cell phones back at that age, for sure. But we have to think about what's in the best interest of our children, and I can tell you the evidence is pouring in. All the studies are very clear, conclusive, that our kids are learning less, and it's hurting their performance, and it's making it more difficult for class management, for teachers, etc. There's a lot of bad things happening there. So what we've said is, let's be smart about this and say, okay, kids, you still have your cell phones. If parents want to give them to them, and it's hard not to. I get it. I'm a parent. I got a grade 8 and a grade 5. But you can bring them to school. You have a cell phone locker. You put it in the cell phone locker. You go to classes. I'm pretty sure, folks, they'll be able to survive for 5 or 6 hours without a cell phone, and survive to tell the story. I'm quite certain about this. But it is the right thing to do for our kids. And so we've been calling for that for a year and a bit, and the government actually came out and after they said it was a dumb idea, they've now heard from enough teachers and parents to say, well, maybe it is not a bad idea, and now they're saying they might do it. So we'll watch to make sure they do, but I wanted to touch on that too, to make sure you knew about that. Farming, I want to touch on farming quickly, because we are in the agricultural breadbasket here, the Fraser Valley. I just want to be really clear about something. How many people have noticed that groceries are getting really expensive, right? So, and you also notice that politicians love to talk about, how we have to, it's the evil supermarkets and all this kind of stuff. Every politician likes to look for a simple answer to a complex question. Well, I'll tell you, it's not that complex if you think about something. The cost that ends up in the grocery starts going through a whole bunch of supply chain. And transportation is a big part of that supply chain. They got to drive all that stuff around. And if you have carbon tax in your fuel and you're paying big fuel taxes like we are here, British Columbia at the highest fuel prices in North America, well, guess what? All that cost ends up in the final cost of your groceries. And so what we have said, and I think it's important you know this, number one, we are going to get rid of the carbon tax on all agricultural and farming and ranching sector. And the reason that's important is because those folks are already struggling enough. They don't need that extra burden that they're going to pass along anyhow, or try to pass along as part of that cost. But we also said we're scrapping provincial fuel taxes within the first 90 days of government. That's 15 cents a litre. So for those of you living out here, if you drive, say, a Ford F-150, you're probably saving $35 a fill. Well, I can tell you, for families right now that are really struggling, that's a meaningful number, especially if you're filling up once a week. That can really help a family try and get by at a time when it's very difficult to do so. So that's another thing that we've called for. And we've said, and this is an important one, when Trudeau federally said, we're going to get rid of the carbon tax on the East Coast for people that are heating their homes with oil, we said, well, if it's good enough for the East Coast, it ought to be good enough for the West Coast. We would take it off of every home heating fuel, whether it's natural gas, oil, or propane. That's another commitment we've made. And we can do that because ours is actually a BC-made carbon tax. So there's the federal one that backstops it. I can't get rid of it. I can't promise you things I can't deliver. So I can't say I can get rid of that one because that's federal. So the people that, by the way, tell you we're scrapping the carbon tax, you might want to ask the question, how are you doing that when there's a federal carbon tax backstopping the provincial one? But we can, with our provincial one, decide what's in and out. And that's why we can take it off of fuels, and that's farmers, and that's why we can take it off of heating fuels. And we will do that. So that's important because cost of living is a huge issue. I can talk about housing later if you want to, because we've ended up over the last 7 years now, we've got the most unaffordable housing, not just in Canada, by the way, but in North America. That's not a very good result. And we've got the highest average rents in Canada. And that's not a good result. And I can tell you, I hear heartbreaking stories. I was in Langley at a senior center, and I met a woman who's 67 years old, and she's doing DoorDash to try and make extra money so that she can pay her, for her prescription drugs. That's very sad. That's not the British Columbia that people signed up for, right? So we have to recognize that we got a long way to go to start saying, hey, how do we actually reduce the burden on people instead of constantly cranking it up? So we can talk about that a little bit. Let's see, so I've done it. Drugs, drugs, yeah. I want to talk about drugs because, I've got kids, and you've all got kids and grandkids, and I want to tell you that when the NDP government said we're going to decriminalize hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, we as the opposition said, whoa. This is a very, very dangerous, very bad idea. Before you do this, you better make sure there are guardrails in place. And by guardrails, I mean you want to make sure it's not going to cause just open drug use to take place in parks, playgrounds, beaches, public spaces, etc. We want to make sure that there's going to be educational component so that young kids understand that decriminalization doesn't mean it's legal or that it's even safe. All those kind of messages, like all that has to be there. And even the federal government said to them, okay, we'll let you do this experiment, because that's what they're doing. They're exempting them from the criminal code to allow BC to do this. The only province doing it, by the way, because the rest of them are smart enough to realize it's probably not a good idea. But when they said that, they said, we also want you to collect data to make sure that the public can see whether this is working or not. Okay, so we're 1 year into it. I should tell you that probably for the last year, we have been calling for restrictions because we saw an explosion of open drug use taking place in parks and playgrounds and beaches and all this. And what we said to the government was, look, We're not trying to, make people feel terrible or anything, but my God, in Vancouver, I can't go to the beach and just drink open alcohol. There's a restriction there. I can't even use a plastic straw there. I can't smoke cigarettes on the beach. Those are legitimate restrictions that the city's put in place. Well, how is it possible that I can go and pull out a crack pipe and start smoking crack in front of families there? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why wouldn't we apply the same standard? And I could never get an answer out of government why they refused to do this, except that we were apparently stigmatizing people. And so I said, okay, I remember being in the legislature going over this with Evie. I said, well, okay, so stigmatizing. I said, we brought in the smoking changes in British Columbia when I was part of government. And we said, you're not going to be able to smoke in restaurants anymore, and in nightclubs and office buildings. And we got lots of pushback, I should tell you. But we did that because smoking rates were going up, especially amongst young people. So we said, we're going to put restrictions in place so that people can't just, smoke wherever they want and all the rest of it. Well, guess what? Smoking rates started going down. And it was very successful. And by the way, nobody wanted to go back to the way it was. Even the smokers said, we don't like going to restaurants that are all smoky anymore, so we're okay with this. So people learned to adjust, and it was stigmatizing them, admittedly, because people have to stand outside their office building and have a smoke or whatever, and I'm sure there's some stigma associated with that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But imagine if we'd taken the same approach that this government's taking with drug use, and said, okay, well, we don't want anyone to feel upset, so here's free drugs, first of all, and feel free to use them wherever you want, because we don't want you to feel stigmatized in any way, shape, or form. And let's see how that experiment ends up. Well, sadly, it's not ended up well. And just a week ago, the results came out, sadly, of the overdose death rates. 2,511 died last year of drug overdose, just in 1 year. The highest ever recorded level in BC history. And the year before was the highest level in recorded BC history. And the year before that was the highest level. So it's just gone up every single year. Now, I can tell you, most of you know, that if you're in government or business or anything else, and you're getting increasingly worse results every year on something, typically you'd say to yourself, maybe doubling down and doing more of the same isn't such a good idea. We should try something different. And that's what we're saying. We're saying, no, don't just hand out free drugs, how about free treatment? How about helping people get the health and care they need? And that's what we've called for in a very thoughtful plan called Better as Possible, where we will invest upfront in addiction facilities in every region of the province to make sure that those that are struggling with addiction have a place to go, and it's not going to result in families having to mortgage their house or sell their car to get their child the care that they need, or their sibling or parent, or whatever the case may be. And the second thing we said, and this ties into the criminal activity in some ways, is on the mental health side. We have to acknowledge that when governments made the decision way back in the late 70s to start closing down institutions like Riverview, Essendale, Tronquil up in Kamloops, and the idea was, sounding good at the time, was let's close these places down and put people back into the communities with all these lovely supports. Well, the problem is that the closing down part went well, the back in the community part went well, but the supports didn't. So we've got a lot of folks, you see them all the time, right, with untreated mental health issues, roaming the streets, being exploited by drug dealers, sometimes human traffickers, whatever the case may be, not capable of making decisions in their own best interest. That's got to end. And we're going to invest in new purpose-built facilities where those folks can compassionately be taken from the streets. Not everyone, by the way, has to be. Lots of people just need outpatient care. So I'm talking about the really severe folks with severe untreated mental health, where we can get them off the streets into proper care with psychiatric and medical supports so that they can thrive and do well again. Many will, not all will, but they still deserve compassionate response and care, and that's a duty that I think government owes to those folks who, by the way, are usually a sibling, a parent, a son, a daughter, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to stop there. Did I get everything? Jackie, did I leave anything out? Okay, let's open up. This is the fun part.